Welcome back, everyone. Well, if you're anything like me, you probably love historic-based TV series and movies, even if sometimes they're only loosely based on history. One of the reasons I'm okay with that, as somebody who loves to get things right on history, is that those things can cause us to have an interest or develop a love for a time period and to want to learn more. So, Braveheart, for example, plays fast and loose with the history big time, but it instilled in a lot of people a desire to learn more about the real William Wallace and those events that surrounded him. Same is true for something like Saving Private Ryan, where you have a fictional story that's based a little bit on a real story that's set within the framework of something that really did happen, the invasion of Normandy. And if that causes people to take an interest in that history and learn more about the truth, I'm all for it. And a great example of that right now is the series on Netflix called The Last Kingdom, which is set kind of in the same time period as another series that's been popular in the last several years, Vikings. I prefer The Last Kingdom myself, but they're both great. And I just finished watching season 5 of The Last Kingdom that just came out, and it was fantastic. There's a movie that's coming out that's going to kind of wrap up that story. And so I thought it would be really interesting to dive into the real history behind some of the events that are portrayed in The Last Kingdom. So we're going to take a look at a couple of videos from our friends at Kings and Generals. And the video we're looking at today is about the Vikings, the great heathen army, specifically the events that lead up to the Battle of Ashdown in 871. So join me as we go on that journey.
The Viking Age was relatively short, but it left a distinctive mark on history. The warriors, raiders, pirates, seafarers and traders from Scandinavia influenced the fate of more regions than any other culture before the Age of Discovery.
He's absolutely right about that. I think most people associate the Vikings with their raids on the eastern part of England, and up further north than that. But really, they attacked Paris. They showed up in what is today Russia and Ukraine. They were kind of everywhere. They would raid anywhere that made sense. They ended up in Iceland and Denmark and in North America at one point. And that term Viking doesn't describe who the people were. It's more about what they did. And they didn't have pointy helmets and things like that, but that's a story for another day.
And no other land more so than the British Isles. In this series, we will talk about the Viking invasions of Britain, and we are going to start with the invasion of the Great Heathen Army.
So I guess this is actually a whole series, so we'll go ahead and go through this whole thing. I don't know how many episodes there are, but if there's only a few, we'll do them all back to back. We do have a vote up on Patreon right now asking what the next series is going to be. And so that series, whatever you guys choose or whatever video gets chosen, and right now it seems to be between two, will follow this.
The Romans had pulled out of Britain by the 5th century, and left in their wake a patchwork of Brittonic and Romano-Brittonic kingdoms. It didn't take long for warlike peoples on the peripheries to move in and take advantage of this. The Picts attacked from beyond Hadrian's Wall. Irish warriors moved in from the west, but most importantly, Angles, Saxons, Jutes and Frisians moved from mainland Europe onto the east of the island.
And so the Angles and the Saxons are where you get that term Anglo-Saxon. And the Angles will eventually lend their name to Angleland, which becomes England. So England is this kind of really cool patchwork of a bunch of other places. In a lot of ways, it's like the United States today, who is made up of people from all over the place. You've got the Anglos, the Saxons, the Picts, the Hibernians. You've got the remnants of the Romans and the Britons. Then you're going to have the Scandinavians who are going to come in the form of the Vikings. And then you're going to have the Normans, who also have Viking roots. They were the Northmen. Much of Normandy was really Viking. And then they kind of intermarried with the Franco people that were there. And, so England's kind of all of that. It's really cool.
The these incoming warrior cultures had replaced the Romano-Britons and Britons on the eastern portion of the island by the end of the 7th century, and formed 7 distinct kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Kent, Sussex, and Essex.
One of the cool things I really like about the series The Last Kingdom is that when they show a lot of these places, a lot of these towns, for example, they give you not only the Anglo-Saxon name, but also the Viking name for those places. This area up here eventually became known as the Danelaw. It was an area that was under control of the Danes or the Vikings. So you have places like York, which is the word for that large town in England in the north today, which is derived from the Viking word for what I think the Anglo-Saxons called Effowich. So it's kind of cool to see all of that, and they'll show the Anglo-Saxon name and then they'll shorten it to the modern day name of that place today. And some of these names you can see where they come from. Essex is the East Saxons. Sussex is the South Saxons, and Wessex are the West Saxons. The Angles settled a little further to the north, and then eventually all of these are going to merge, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Eventually, these kingdoms all converted to Christianity, yet became no less warlike, continuing to fight amongst themselves and with their native neighbours. Meanwhile, another warlike culture had been developing over the centuries across the North Sea.
Now, what you notice is that London, or Londinium, I think is what it was known as under the Romans, is not one of the major towns involved in all this. Winchester is the capital for Wessex. I believe Aylesbury or something like that becomes the seat of Mercia later on. But yeah. Nothing unites people who are warring with each other much like an external threat. And that Viking threat is eventually what's going to cause the peoples of what we know today as England, the Anglos and Saxons, to join up with one another or to conquer one another so that they can focus on the threat to the north and east.
In Scandinavia. It was there in the frosted fjord lands of Norway and the islands and archipelagos of Denmark that peoples related to the Anglo-Saxons had lived since the last ice age. They were still pagan, and above all else, they placed importance on military power and seafaring prowess. A combination of popular pressure, Frankish aggression from the south, and a revolution in shipbuilding techniques gradually forced these people to look outwards from Scandinavia towards the end of the 8th century. Soon, the dragon heads of their longships were first sighted off the shore of Britain. These opportunistic Scandinavians would eventually become known as Vikings, a word which described their profession as pirates, not their ethnicity. To the horror of the Christian writers of the time, who were almost exclusively monks, the Vikings focused on attacking Christian holy sites, which tended to yield the best monetary rewards.
So, why were monks the ones writing the history down? Well, monks by and large were the people who could read and write. This is a time long before things like the printing press. And so, it was an art form to be able to write and to chronicle things. And so we have people like the Venerable Bead, who becomes one of the most well-known historians from that time period. Much of what we know from the history of this time comes from people like him, and then later on people. In fact, let's take a look at that a little more. So the Venerable Bead is a guy who lives from 672 to 735. He's an English monk who's often known as the father of English history. He's from Northumbria, lives and dies in Northumbria, and he writes down a lot of the early history of what's happening in the Anglo-Saxon world. And then it's people like him who are then going to give us the history of what's happening later on with these Viking invasions.
All over the north of Britain and Ireland, great riches were plundered and carried off. However, their tactics began to change. The most ambitious began to overwinter within Britain, and settlers from Norway began to either replace or subjugate the existing populations on the Faroe Islands, Orkney, Shetland, and in areas of Ireland.
So, they start out just as raiding parties. They come in, they grab the treasure, and they get out. They kill a bunch of people in the process. But now they're thinking, you know what? We're having some success here. Why can't we just take this land? Why can't we just own it? And right up almost to the Norman invasion, you have Danes ruling England. At different times, not always.
Mercia gradually lost its dominance during the early 9th century and was replaced by Wessex under its king Egbert, a shrewd leader who had been educated across the Channel in Francia.
And the first kings of a united England are going to be known as the House of Wessex.
Egbert was all too familiar with the Vikings and fought a number of battles against them during his reign, most notably at Carhampton in 836.
Using the Total War images. Pretty cool.
He conquered the minor kingdoms of Essex, Sussex and Kent during his reign, firmly establishing his kingdom as the most powerful. In 865, Ethelred became the King of Wessex. It was during that year that a vast armada of longships appeared off the coast of East Anglia to make landfall near Thetford.
And it's important to note, too, that during this time, it wasn't a hereditary monarchy necessarily, though very often it did work out that way. But they had a group known as the Witan. There were these eldermen. There were these, village elders. I mean, country elders, basically the precursor to barons, to earls and lords and things like that. And earl's actually a term that comes from the Norse influence. But they would choose who the next successor was. But very often it would be someone who was a child or a sibling of a previous monarch.
This was unlike any Scandinavian raiding force seen previously. It was made up of hundreds of ships, carrying an international army of Danes, Norsemen and Swedes.
Now, could you imagine for a second being on the coast? By this point, they expect these raids to happen, and they're often a couple of ships, and it's a small force. They come in, they go out. Imagine seeing that coming. What do? I mean, where do you go? You can't fight. You got to run, I would think.
To the horror of the Christian writers of the time, who dubbed it the Great Heathen Army, they had come together from Ireland, Frisia, Francia, Scandinavia and Pictland to launch a full-scale invasion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Initially, the army seems to have been led by 3 war leaders. According to the Norse sagas, these were the sons of the legendary Viking Ragnar Lodbrok.
So if you have seen the series Vikings, you're familiar with Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons and that whole story. There's where he comes in. And Ragnar's one of those people that's steeped in a lot of legend. We don't know. I mean, some people claim he didn't even really exist. And if he did exist, a lot of what we think we know about him, we don't really know for sure. I think he probably did exist. It's hard to say much more than that.
Ivar, Halfdan and Ubba. And they had come to England to avenge the death of their father, killed by the Northumbrian king, Aella.
So Aella or Aella, that story is told in Vikings as well. Supposedly Ragnar is thrown into a pit of snakes, and that's how he's killed. And then the sons of Ragnar come back on Aella and get revenge on him by doing the bloody eagle, is the story that goes, where they crack open the back and they pull his lungs out and they make them like wings. Horrible stuff. But that was this time period. I mean, they were brutal.
It is just as likely, however, that the invasion was the natural culmination of decades of raids by ambitious warriors.
I noticed they actually are using the pictures from Vikings. I recognize Ivar the Boneless right away.
Who now saw a way to carve kingdoms out for themselves. After landing in East Anglia, they forced the local king Edmund to give them horses and supplies before they marched north to capture the capital of Northumbria, York. After this battle, Northumbria would become a bastion of Scandinavian culture for the next 2 centuries.
Yep.
After ravaging Northumbria, the army again went on the move, likely gathering more and more warriors to their banners from all over the Scandinavian world.
Not Nottingham. My paternal line, my father's side, comes from a little town right outside of Nottingham that's kind of the center of the Robin Hood legend, so to speak. But again, that's a story for another day.
As word spread of their victories. They marched south into Mercia and captured the town of Nottingham. Mercian king Burgred called for support, and Wessex answered the call, yet no fighting took place.
So like I said before, there's nothing that can unite warring groups of people like an external threat. So now you got Mercia and Wessex are going to have to fight together.
As Ivar and his men remained inside the walls of Nottingham. Eventually Burgred paid them to leave, and the Mercian and West Saxon armies, mostly made up of farmers, disbanded to plough their fields. Happy to take Mercian coin for now, the Vikings moved back to York for the winter, considerably richer. The sons of Lodbrok kept their word to Burgred, heading back to East Anglia in the new year, where they stamped out the kingdom entirely and turned its king Edmund into a martyr.
So the guy that gave them food and supplies and kind of tried to buy them off, they just turned right back around on him.
East Anglia would suffer the same fate as Northumbria, becoming a foothold for the Danes for the next 2 centuries. In 870, the army split, with some remaining in their new lands in Northumbria and East Anglia, and others, like Ivar, going elsewhere in Britain to conquer other lands, in this case the kingdom of Altclud in southern Scotland. It was Halfdan who took centre stage at this point, as he led part of the army south, bypassing Mercia entirely to raid deep into Wessex. Halfdan, along with another warlord, Bacseg, made straight for the town of Reading, where they fortified themselves to wait for the inevitable West Saxon counterattack. King Aethelred and his brother Alfred gathered up.
Alfred, one of my favorite all-time rulers of any kingdom. Alfred the Great, the only king, and he wasn't a king of England because England didn't exist yet, but he had a dream of uniting England as a nation, and it was his children and grandchildren who carried that dream out. But he's one of the prime, parts of the story in The Last Kingdom, and I thought portrayed beautifully by the actor who played him.
Up their levies and made for Reading. Together they attacked Halfdan's men at Reading on the 4th of January, but suffered a minor defeat. The West Saxons regrouped over the next few days, and again took to the field on the 8th, at a place called Ashdown, somewhere in Berkshire. It was there, in the mist and gloom of a midwinter's morning, that the most decisive battle yet of the war was fought. Aethelred divided his army into 2, positioning the halves on either side of a ridgeway.
And Alfred was not seen by people as a great warrior. He was a kind of a tiny guy, very sickly for most of his life. What Alfred had going for him was his mind and his cunning. He was brilliant in that regard, even if he wasn't a great warrior on the battlefield.
With himself in command of one side, and his younger brother Alfred commanding the other. As the Danes approached, they also split their army, with Halfdan commanding one side and Bacseg the other. Alfred and his contingent watched on from behind their shield wall as the Danes drew closer. Meanwhile, Aethelred had apparently decided that he had to pray before the battle, and refused to advance until his prayer service was complete. Seeing that the Danish movement would cost him the advantage of the higher ground, Alfred decided to charge up the hill without the support of the second contingent, and headed straight into the heart of the Danish lines.
Who are then going to turn on his flank.
Apparently not realizing that Alfred's men only represented half of the West Saxon army, the second force of the Danes also moved against them. The battle turned into an hours-long, brutal hand-to-hand slog of shield wall on shield wall.
And I mean, the exhaustion level that these men must have experienced, because it took so much strength to fight behind these shield walls. A lot of it involves pushing and trying to break up the shield wall and trying to get at the men. And, you're fighting for hours and not necessarily inflicting a ton of casualties. It's not this big, wide open kind of everybody's just slashing at everybody and spinning around and fighting 3 people around them. It's a line hitting a line and just boom, boom, boom. A whole lot of that for hours until somebody breaks.
After heavy fighting and significant losses on both sides, Aethelred's force, whose approach was obscured in mist, finally engaged, surprising the Danes and turning the battle in favour of the West Saxons.
Isn't it interesting how sometimes mistakes that get made or things that seem to spell disaster can end up turning things around? In this case, Alfred being forced to face the entire army with only half of the Wessex army looks like a bad thing, and it looks like he's going to get hit on his flank. But the fact that they held and were able to weaken and tire out these men then made it possible for the rest of the Wessex army to come in and break that other side of the line. And so maybe that doesn't happen if the whole line moves forward at once like it should have. A similar thing happens a couple of centuries later at the Battle of Hastings, where you have what seems like the end for William, the Duke of Normandy's forces, when the forces of the Anglo-Saxon king come charging down the hill, thinking that they've won a great victory and they're going to follow it up by routing the enemy, and that attack ends up being what spells their doom. If they'd have just held, they would have won.
Bacseg was killed in the fighting, and Halfdan called for his remaining men to fall back, leaving the West Saxons victorious. After 6 long years of defeat, an Anglo-Saxon army had finally emerged victorious against the great Heathen army. Ashdown was by no means a decisive victory, and it was certainly a costly one, though the hard fighting may have made Halfdan more cautious about his future plans for Wessex.
So, speaking of costly, let's take a look at the best we know about what the numbers look like at this battle. So again, keeping in mind that we really can't know any of this for sure, and these are all just best guesses based on the information available. The Battle of Ashdown was fought 8th January 871. The Saxon army was around 800 to 1,000 men. So you can maybe figure 500 on each side of this thing. So these are not large numbers we're talking about. They held a small advantage in numbers, but the Danes held the high ground. So you can figure maybe the entire battle is between 1,500 to 2,000 men on both sides. Not a large battle, but again, because the way they fought, you're not seeing significant casualties happening in an instant. And so this isn't like some of the later battles that you'll see in things like the Wars of the Roses, where you have tens of thousands of casualties in a few hours. This is very, very different kind of warfare.
6. To the fortune of Halfdan and his remaining warriors, who had fallen back to Reading, reinforcements arrived to join them. This great summer army of fresh warriors, led by a sea king named Guthrum, would become integral over the next 7 long years of war. Aethelred and Alfred, now known as the Boar of Ashdown, continued to fight the Danes over the coming months. By April, however, Aethelred was dead, possibly as a result of wounds suffered in battle, and Alfred replaced him as king.
Which a lot of people did not see coming. Alfred, like I said earlier, was not the guy people expected to be a great warrior king. But he became the great. Tells you all you need to know about the man.
Halfdan had had enough of Wessex by this point, and accepted a large sum of money from Alfred as payment to leave. He would head north to become the king in Northumbria, whereas Guthrum went east to take control of the Vikings of East Anglia. Alfred had saved his kingdom for now, but he and all of his subjects knew the Vikings would return.
Yep. All right, so interesting stuff. We are going to continue this series. I want to take a look real quick and see how many episodes there are. So it looks like there's three episodes to this. So we will watch the next two over the next 2 days, and then we will move into whatever you guys have voted for over on Patreon to be our next series. Thank you and welcome to our new patrons, and welcome to all of our new subscribers. There's been a lot the last couple of days. We're adding over 1,000 new subscribers a day. So I'm going to post a video later today just kind of introducing myself to those of you who may be new, to let you know a little bit about me, about my background, about how this channel got started, things like that. I am actually headed to the airport now for a quick 24 hours right outside of New York City. I'm speaking at a school in southeastern New York. So we'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.